Good evening, and welcome to Lawyers on the Line. I'm Sean Quinn, a partner at the Duluth law firm of Falsani, Balmer, Peterson, Quinn, and Beyer, and this evening's moderator. Capital punishment is a hot-button topic no matter what state you live in. Is it a deterrent to a crime? Is it a reasonable penalty? Here tonight to discuss the subjects are our panelists, Ed Cassidy of the Frederickson and Byron law firm, and Rick Holmstrom, a criminal defense attorney from Duluth. Ed and Rick will respond to your questions about capital punishment. Please call us at 218-788-2844. Or, if that's long distance for you, call our toll-free line 1-877-307-8762. All right, gentlemen, capital punishment's the topic. And Ed, I'll start with you. What's the best argument for capital punishment?
I think the best and most common argument is retribution. Eye for an eye.
Simple as that.
Well, I think that's what the statutes say.
Okay. And are there any other arguments that
Well, there are many other arguments. One that's used frequently is that it is a deterrent. But the people that have looked at the issue, studied it, have not been able to find any correlation between the death penalty and deterring capital crimes.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, some of the states that have capital punishment have higher murder rates than states that don't have it.
Yeah, I heard a lawyer from Texas once describe it as every year we got to kill a few people in Texas to teach the rest of us that killing ain't right. So.
Oh, okay. There you go. So, but an eye for an eye retribution is the best argument for.
Right.
Okay. The best argument against, Rick?
Well, the best argument against is that if you make a mistake, it is fatal. There's no chance to, if it turns out that either the defendant is innocent or for some reason got the shaft somewhere along the line, there's no way that you can remedy that. The person is dead and you can't bring him back to life.
Okay. So what is it that what is the crime or the crimes that result in somebody getting that ultimate punishment?
Well, in the state level, it's typically first-degree murder. And then many states that have the death penalty also require that that there are aggravating factors, so that it's a particularly heinous crime, for example, or the victim was particularly vulnerable, those sorts of things.
A child or someone like that. Yeah. Okay. And then you said at the state level, at the federal level, different levels or different crimes?
I'm not as familiar with the federal level, but it would be certain crimes including terrorism.
Okay. Treason, I believe, is punishable by death. All right.
And also murder. And
federal levels of murder.
Right.
Now, Minnesota, of course, we do not have the death penalty at the state level, but we are governed by federal law as well in Minnesota. So a person could commit a crime in Minnesota that ultimately could result in the death penalty? Right.
That's correct.
Okay.
And in fact, I believe her name was Drew Shadeen, that murder case. I believe she was murdered in Minnesota. I believe the body, either that or she was murdered in North Dakota and the body was found in Minnesota or vice versa. I can't remember.
Young college student.
Young college student. And it was the feds came in, asserted jurisdiction, however, did not try the case in Minnesota. They would have, well, for that matter, the feds could try it in Hawaii, I suppose, if they wanted to, but decided to try it in North Dakota instead of Minnesota. Minnesota, of course, does not have the death penalty. I think they figured they'd get a better chance in North Dakota where they did have the death penalty.
Oh, with the jury giving the death penalty.
Correct.
All right.
Correct.
And that brings up the question of, somebody commits a crime that is theoretically punishable with death. Does that automatically mean that's going to be their punishment?
no.
Okay. Explain what happened.
I think it's helpful to keep in mind, Sean, that if you're charged with capital murder, there's going to be two trials. The first trial is called the guilt phase. Are you going to get convicted or not? And if you're convicted, and this, of course, in states with the death penalty, and if you're convicted of first-degree murder, then the penalty phase starts right away. And in the penalty phase, the jury will be asked to sentence. Some states, like Florida, they have the jury consider the mitigating factors in the penalty phase, but the judge has the ultimate say on the sentence. But most states that have the death penalty, it's the jury that decides in that second trial.
Okay. Now, there's a somewhat highly publicized murder trial that just took place in Arizona. A young woman convicted of killing her boyfriend. And as I recall from the news stories, there was actually a hung jury on the penalty phase for her.
Right.
So they're going to retry the penalty phase?
I believe that's unique to Arizona.
Okay. Normally, it's if they can't reach 100% unanimous agreement on the death penalty, then it's going to be life.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, so you described there's the guilt phase and the penalty phase. The person is convicted. They've been assessed the death penalty. They don't get the chair the next day. There's a long series of litigation after that. Why don't we go through that?
Well, after the conviction, the states have an automatic appeal to their own Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court. Once that appeal is, if the verdict is sustained, both the guilt and the death sentence, then the prisoner is left with what's called post-conviction relief. In other words, you can go back to court under essentially a habeas corpus theory, which means, Judge, I know that we've had our direct appeal, you've considered all the stuff that happened in my trial, but here's what happened. For example, a common claim in that scenario is ineffective assistance of counsel, because the United States Supreme Court has held that you're entitled to a lawyer in criminal matters.
The Gideon case.
Right. But you're also entitled to a competent lawyer. All right. And so in a lot of these cases where the person's already been convicted and sentenced to death, particularly in certain areas of the country, they can have very poor quality of representation. And at that stage, after the conviction, the lawyers are trying to convince the judge that it was so ineffective that it was a non-constitutional trial.
Okay. And Rick, let me go to you then. Why would that happen? Why would someone's being charged with murder, capital crime? Why would they have an ineffective attorney?
Well, of course, it all depends on who's representing them and what the resources are. Again, I don't think these numbers are exactly accurate, but in the United States, probably between 80 and 90% of all criminal defendants are represented by public defenders.
Okay. And these aren't just murder criminal defendants.
No, I'm just talking generally.
All criminal defendants.
And so, it is highly likely in most cases that the case is going to start out with a public defender representing that individual. It all depends, of course, on what kind of resources that public defender's office has, how good the lawyer is representing him.
All right, now, there's very good public defender attorneys out there.
Sure.
But what problems do the public defenders have in representing somebody, especially in a murder case?
Well, number one, you've got a high caseload. I haven't done public defender work now for 16 or 17 years. But I know when I did do that, and I was part-time, we were running over 100 cases these are felony cases now, over 100 felony cases per year, and usually at least one first-degree murder case along with it. So, there's a lot of other tugs on your time while you're doing it. Now,
there's a lot of work to defend somebody in a criminal case.
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay.
And again, I'm not suggesting anybody was ineffective,
right.
even in our theoretical scenario here, because of course, as time goes on, let's assume now you're a defendant and you have gotten the death penalty, you've gone through your state Supreme Court, you now have a limited grounds that you can appeal on from there. So generally, they're going to, rightly or wrongly, they're going to blame their original lawyer for their conviction.
Sure. Okay. So you go through that process. You go back to the same judge you were in front of who convicted you or who sentenced you?
Yeah. Or you're going back to the state court.
At least the same court level.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And you're not going to win there.
Well,
or are you?
That's the position one of our cases is in now, is we're in front of the state court judge in Louisiana. But if you don't prevail there, then you can go back to the state Supreme Court.
Okay. Appeal that issue.
And if the prisoner is unsuccessful at that level, then they can go into federal court.
Okay. And now we're at federal trial court level.
Yes.
And what are you arguing there? You've already argued you weren't guilty or you shouldn't have gotten the death penalty. You already argued you had ineffective assistance of counsel or some other grounds. What are you arguing in federal court?
Well, you're required to make the same arguments.
Okay, so you can't raise new things now at this point.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, there are people who will say, well, now you're getting your third bite at the apple. When is enough enough?
Well, and I think enough is enough when you're convinced that the trial was fair to begin with. And the part of that answer is in the statistics that you and I talked about earlier.
Okay. All right, let's talk about that. What do the statistics show us regarding death penalty defendants?
Well, I think you've got the precise number in terms of executions since 1976.
Okay, so let's take a look at this. Since 1976, 1,226 people in the United States executed. I think these statistics are dated from 2010, so they might be a couple of years old. But.
And of those, 135 some have been exonerated.
Okay, those who were not put to death, but who were on death row.
Were on death row and exonerated.
Okay, so for every 10 people who were executed, there was one person who was about to be that
Shouldn't have been.
was let go.
Right.
Okay, and
I think that's a compelling reason.
these appeals ultimately can be successful about 10% of the time.
Right, and some of those cases where people were exonerated, it was the evidence being presented to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor becoming later convinced that they had the wrong guy.
Okay.
So not all of it's the direct result of litigation.
Okay, and that goes to what you were saying, Rick, that once the death penalty is carried out,
Well, exactly.
there's no going back.
And also the progress of science figures in here. DNA was a big leap forward, obviously, where now a lot of crimes that were committed before DNA testing was available, if the evidence has still been preserved, that evidence can still be tested, and some of the most high-profile acquittals, or excuse me, where the convictions have been overturned, is where they prove that not only shouldn't this guy get the death penalty, but he didn't do it in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay, and that goes to, going back to these phases of litigation involved with the death penalty. You said you go to federal court, and I suppose then federal appellate court levels after that.
Right.
This sounds incredibly time-consuming and costly.
It is both.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, what type of numbers are we talking about as far as both time and money?
That's real hard to say because these cases are all different, but it is a requirement by the American Bar Association, for example, that these cases be handled by a team of lawyers.
Okay.
So no one lawyer should be handling one of these cases.
Too much,
It's
too much work.
Too much work.
Okay.
Too easy to miss something.
Okay. And going back to these statistics that we were looking at, it says in here that the average cost of a death penalty case, just the litigation, we're not talking about the prison costs or the housing costs of the inmate, is something like $2.5 million. That's just
the
seems
initial
extraordinary.
trial.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
All right, so
And, excuse me, the other thing that's, to me, potentially ironic is that if you take a look at the number of executions that we've had since the 70s, and then look at how long it has taken from the time of the trial for the prisoner to be executed, I think the average is like 20 years.
yeah. And so there's that cost and time as well.
Right.
Okay. Now, we mentioned that I think Minnesota has no death penalty. We already talked about that. There's about 15 states that do not, give or take.
I think the number is 33 states have it. It was
Okay, so
Maryland
17.
recently overturned their own death penalty, and so did New Mexico.
Okay. Now, as far as the United States is concerned, where does the United States fit in sort of the worldwide as, the countries that have death penalties versus countries that do not?
Well, I think it might be the only Western country that has the death penalty. I'm not aware of any European countries that have it.
Okay. All right. Well, I've got pop quiz for both of you. I warned you that this was going to be the pop quiz. 2/3 of countries abolished the death penalty, the United States not being one. Of in the past 10 years, the vast majority of executions have taken place in 5 states. Name the 5 states.
5 states or 5 countries?
Or 5 countries. So I'll go with you first, Rick.
Well, obviously the United States would be one of them. Saudi Arabia, China, I believe Iran, and I'm guessing.
All right, you got one more guess. You gave us 4.
I would go with probably another Arabic country, let's say the United Arab Emirates.
Okay, it's a pretty good guess. You got 3.
Okay.
Well,
Your top 5.
My top 5 would have been, next top 5, I would probably add North Korea.
Well, China, Iran, North Korea, Yemen. So a Saudi country, but not Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, and then the United States. So here you go. Now we've got some callers, and kind of going to what we talked about briefly. A caller asks, why does it take so long for the execution to happen after the sentencing? And I think it involves all of those post-conviction appeal levels.
Yes.
Okay. Why did they take so long? I mean, why? Okay, I'm going to appeal it. Why doesn't it take the judge a couple of weeks or a couple of months to wrap this up?
Well, that's a question that the United States Congress and Senate has wrestled with in the mid-90s, thereabouts. They passed the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act. And part of the impediment, or the motivation for that, I should say, was to shorten those. So they shortened some time frames. But lawyers being lawyers, time can be your friend in these post-conviction cases. And you take a case, for example, to the United States Supreme Court, it'll take a long time for a decision to be rendered. But it's basically, this litigation takes a long time.
Okay. Yeah, and in the federal system, though, it does speed it up.
Yes.
Because you're not dealing with 2 tiers of appellate levels. If you can recall the Oklahoma City bombing, the defendant in that, Timothy McVeigh, was executed within a few years of the event, although I think he waived his final appeal, if I remember correctly.
I believe you're correct, Rick. And he didn't go through all those state levels, as you mentioned. So.
Correct.
Now, another caller asks, if you're under the age of 18 or under the age of 16, can you be sentenced to the death penalty?
No.
Okay. Is there a hard line?
Yeah, the Supreme Court has held that it's unconstitutional to execute a minor.
Okay. So, and is it at the time of the commission of the crime?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
And they've also held that it's unconstitutional, or cruel and unusual punishment is the term they use, to execute someone who's mentally retarded.
Okay. And now there was a case not that long ago where an individual was either, if not mentally retarded, at least had some sort of mental illness. And when the person was receiving proper medication, they were better. The illness wasn't gone, but they were at least under control. And I believe the Supreme Court said something like, okay, medicate them, then you can kill them. Something like that.
That sounds familiar, but I can't put my finger on it.
All right, now, Rick, I'll go to you. The question kind of goes to what it takes to get the death penalty. Someone wants to know, what is the difference between first-degree murder and second-degree murder and, say, manslaughter?
Well, first-degree murder is, number one, taking the life of a human being with intentionally and with what's called malice aforethought. In other words, some type of planning. That's first-degree murder. Second-degree murder is intentionally taking the life of someone without malice aforethought, or at least malice aforethought is not one of the elements of the crime. Now, there's all sorts of different versions of first-degree murder and second-degree murder, but that's the traditional distinction.
Okay, then what's manslaughter then?
Manslaughter is you did not intend to kill the individual, but either because of extreme circumstances or extreme negligence, you committed the crime. And manslaughter goes down in degrees from manslaughter in the first degree, manslaughter in the second degree.
Okay, all right. And first-degree murder is the crime that will ultimately result in the death penalty, at least in some circumstances.
Correct.
And in some states.
None of the other crimes we talked about qualify for the death penalty, at least on the state level. Again, in the federal level, you've got a terrorism aspect to it, and there's also the treason. You can be executed for treason.
All right, now, somebody asked a question, and I'm going to try to paraphrase it as best as I can. When somebody gets the death penalty, the question is, what does that really mean? And I think the caller, I assume, intends, are they really going to get the death penalty? Do most people get it or not?
Well, if you're sentenced to death,
Yeah.
you're going to get the death penalty unless some judge intervenes down the road, saying, for example, well, your trial was flawed enough that it's unconstitutional, you should get a new trial. So unless some judge says something like that, you'll be executed. The other option is that most states allow for clemency hearings. So, for example, if you've run your course of appeals and habeas corpus and that, you can go to the governor and ask for clemency because of some unique circumstances. But otherwise, it means you will be executed.
It might be 10, 20 years down the road, but that's what's going to happen.
Right. Well, that's where those numbers come from.
Okay. Okay. And again, another one of the interesting statistics, I grabbed the sheet again, was just the number of people on death row right now, or at least as of 2010, 3,261, which when I first saw that, I thought, boy, I would have guessed it was higher. But then I thought, that's still a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, and the numbers of death sentences have gone consistently down.
Over the past, what, about 10 years?
About 10 years, yeah.
Okay. Fewer death sentences every year.
Yes.
Okay, now let's talk about, there's sort of a racial overtone to death penalty cases that is somewhat surprising in that, as I understand it, it doesn't involve necessarily the defendant, but it involves the victim.
I think the studies consistently show that the race of the victim is more of a determinant in whether the death penalty is requested than the race of the defendant.
How so?
Well, that's. I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer that question. I mean, some people would say it's racism.
Okay.
I think it probably is at the end of the day. But, for example, 76% of the cases where there was a murder victim and it was white, that's 76% of the death penalties come from the race of the victim being white.
Okay. And yet the number of victims of first-degree murder, the race of the victims of the first-degree murder, it's not 76% white, it's
Right.
it's lower.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, another caller wants to know, are there different ways to administer the death penalty? Lethal injection seems to be the one that is most commonly used. Are there others?
I think in the United States it's now all lethal injection. Some states had hanging and firing squad and things like that, but I think they've
Gas
all
chamber?
gas chamber,
electrocution.
electric chair, yeah.
Yeah, fun stuff.
Yeah.
What about there are some arguments that, well, you have to have a physician involved with lethal injection. And physicians aren't supposed to harm people, they're supposed to help people. I mean, Rick, what's...
Well, you'd have to talk to a doctor about that.
Maybe we should have got a
about
doctor on the panel for that.
About whatever the medical ethics of it are. But yeah, obviously you have to have a physician there to determine whether the individual has expired, and is this has the execution been botched, or in fact, was it carried out the way it's supposed to be?
Okay.
If I may.
Yeah.
I'm reasonably certain that physicians will not do that. I mean, that's part of the problems. When they've had problems administering lethal injection, it has probably been because there wasn't a physician doing it, because they won't do it.
Not hitting a vein with the needle or whatever.
Right.
But isn't there a requirement? I mean, it's sort of a medical procedure, as it were, because
No.
we're involving medicines and we're involving, needles going into the skin.
Well, lethal injection's been litigated many, many times, and I think that's one of the arguments, but it's never prevailed.
Okay. And why has lethal injection sort of become the go-to standard for capital punishment in the United States versus the other methods? Rick? Yeah.
Well, I can just guess at it that it's It's much more sanitary, easier to watch kind of a thing. Obviously, if you're going to, somebody shot by a firing squad is, it looks bad when it happens. It also involves, more people that have to be the executioners. Hanging also involves a number of people. It's not pleasant to watch. Not pleasant to watch lethal injection either, but it is much more sanitized, shall we say, than the others. That's just my guess as to
I agree with Nick.
why it's done.
And now in Minnesota, we don't have the death penalty, and part of that is because of a botched execution, correct?
William Williams in 1906, the hanging rope was too long.
Too long.
It was too long,
So he hit the ground.
He hit the ground, and they had to crank him up, strangle him, and then the Minnesota legislature, I think it might have even been the next year, abolished the death penalty.
Okay. Said that's just enough.
We don't want to do this again.
Okay. And there have been efforts from time to try to reestablish it in this state, but never really has gone anywhere as far as I know.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think we're just about out of time, so I'm going to thank both of you. And your questions on tonight's topic, or any legal topic for that matter, can be answered every Wednesday at noon at the St. Louis County Courthouse through the Volunteer Attorney Program's Ask an Attorney service. You can call 723-4005 to make an appointment. You will get 10 to 20 minutes with a local volunteer lawyer who will be able to answer your questions and set you on the right path to find the additional legal help that you may need. The program is free and available to the public regardless of need. Remember, you can watch tonight's program again online at wdse.org or at the Falsani, Balmer, Peterson, Quinn, and Beyer website. Please join us again next week. It's our last week of the year next week when we answer your questions about estate planning. I'd like to thank our panelists for their expertise this evening, and thank you for watching. I'm Sean Quinn. Good night.